Hello, this is Professor Kuehn, and welcome back to my lectures on astronomy. We have been talking this past week about On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres by Copernicus. I gave a number of lectures on chapters 11 and 12 in A Student's Guide to the Great Physics Texts, and I also did an in-class lecture on chapter 13. I have not prepared any YouTube videos for chapter 13 yet. I hope to go back and fill those in at some future time. In any case, what I did in those lectures was provide some of the details about the arguments that Copernicus used for why he thinks that his worldview, the heliocentric worldview, was a better worldview. This is a fairly dense chapter, and what he essentially spends most of his time doing is explaining how, by considering the planets to be going around the sun, he thinks it can better account for, or at least more simply account for, the observed motion of the planets, the moon, and the sun. Again, this is chapter 13, Reordering the Heavenly Spheres, in A Student's Guide to the Great Physics Texts, volume 1. If we look to the end, so in this lecture what I'd like to do is just point out a summary of the Copernican worldview, which I provide at the end of this chapter. So if we jump ahead in this chapter, through all the arguments that he gives for his worldview, by the end, in his chapter 11, which is on page 165, he says a demonstration of the threefold movement of the Earth. And here is where, after explaining in the previous sections why he thinks his worldview is a better worldview, now he summarizes the overall picture that he has. So he mentions that the Earth has three particular movements as it orbits around the sun. And so we're going to spend a couple of moments going through this, and then I'll draw a picture and that kind of summarizes his worldview. So he says, therefore, since so much and such great testimony on the part of the planets is consonant with the mobility or the motion of the Earth, we shall now give a summary of its movement, insofar as the appearances can be shown forth by its movement as by an hypothesis. We must allow a threefold movement altogether. So now he's going to say what those three movements are. And he says the first, which the Greeks called nukthemerinos, it's basically the daily motion of the Earth about its own axis. Therefore, the Earth is spinning around its own axis. You might recall this is something that Plato talks about in the Timaeus. Copernicus is saying, I think this is the case too, and that's what gives rise to the daily rising and setting of the sun, the moon, and the planets. Secondly, and this is on page 166, he says the second is the annual movement of the center, which describes the circle of the zodiacal signs around the sun, similarly from west to east. So what he's talking about here is, in addition to the Earth spinning around its own axis, the center of the Earth itself, is moving in a huge orbit around the sun. It's moving around the sun. That's why it's called heliocentrism. And he says this gives rise to the perception, from our perspective, that the sun is moving through the signs of the zodiac. Again, if this isn't quite clear to you, I'm going to be drawing a picture in a moment to illustrate this. The third movement is the one that I found most perplexing when I first read about it until I understood what he was trying to get at. So I'll mention what it is, and then I'll come back and explain this in more detail shortly. He said the third movement is the motion of the axis of the Earth as it moves contrary to the direction the Earth is going around the sun. So you might think about, if the Earth, I'm showing here with my thumb, if the Earth has an axis like this, and it's spinning around its own axis, and then if here's the sun, and the Earth is moving around the sun like this, he says basically that the Earth, if it was going around the sun, that axis would be tilting, so it would always stay kind of tilted away from the sun, if you think about it that way. But it's not. Instead, it's rotating back this way so that it always stays oriented in the same direction. You might think about that not as a motion, but as a sitting still. But the reason why he thinks about the counter-rotation of the axis of the Earth as a motion is because he's imagining the Earth as being embedded in a celestial sphere that's rotating around the sun. So if its axis is tilted, then the axis should be kind of fixed, and it should be moving around as the Earth is going around. So if it's going to be staying oriented toward the North Star, it has to be counter-rotating in order to keep it moving, aiming at the North Star. Okay, so maybe to better explain this, let me draw a picture. If we look over here at my sketchbook, I'm going to import an image. Okay, so here what I've shown is the Copernican worldview, and I'm going to highlight some of the things in this diagram to show you how he's thinking about this. So first of all, let me mention that this outer sphere right here, that is the celestial sphere. That is the thing on which, just like all the ancients thought, all of the stars are located. So here is Polaris, the North Star. And of course, all of the other stars are fixed to this celestial sphere. Now, how does Copernicus differ from the ancients? He thinks that instead of this entire sphere as being rotating around, he thinks of this sphere as fixed, a sphere of fixed stars, and the whole thing is not rotating. Instead, he's going to say the Earth is spinning and moving around the sun. So let's draw where the sun is. In the center, he puts the sun at the very center of this celestial sphere. Technically speaking, he does not put it at exactly the center. You'll see a black dot right next to the sun. That is the exact center of the celestial sphere, and you'll see that the sun is slightly displaced from the center. That is to account for the fact that as the Earth goes around that center, at some times it's closer to the sun, at other times it's farther from the sun. So I'll just write right here, this is the sun at the center. Okay, and then where is the Earth? Well, the Earth is this body that's going around the sun. So if you have over here, that's the Earth at one time of the year, and then it's moving around in this direction. So I'll draw an arrow to indicate it's going around. And then later on, it is right here. And then a bit later, it's right here. And then a bit later, it is right here. So the Earth itself, I will indicate here, this is the Earth according to the Copernican worldview. Also notice that the axis of the Earth is tilted. So if I were to point out the axis of the Earth, so this red line right here would indicate the axis of the Earth. There, 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 and there. And the Earth is rotating about its own axis. So I'm going to draw an arrow here representing the fact that the Earth is spinning around its own axis. So that's the spin of the Earth. Notice that if it spins around once per day, then if you're standing on the Earth, you will see the sun rise and set once per day. And then, because the Earth is going around the sun, from the perspective of someone standing on the Earth, looking up at the sun will appear to be moving through the constellations of the zodiac. So here, for example, let's suppose that you are at the Earth when Earth is at position 1. Let's call that right over here. At position 1, if you were to look over at the sun, from your perspective, the sun would be going into the constellation Aries. Aries is right here. So that would correspond to the vernal equinox. Then, as the Earth moves around in this direction toward position 2, I'll put a 2 right here. Well, what's going on then? If you are at position 2 and you look up at the sun, now the sun will appear to be moving from Gemini into Cancer. So it's going over here. So it appears to be entering Cancer. So at position 2, if position 1 was when one was at the vernal equinox, at position 2, that would be the time of the summer solstice. Why is that? Because the sun would appear to be entering Cancer when the Earth is at position 2. By the time the Earth migrates around in this direction, when it gets to position 3, if someone standing on the Earth were to look over at the sun would appear to be going from Virgo into Libra. So this is Libra over here. And so position 3 would correspond to, you guessed it, the autumnal equinox. And finally, as the Earth moves from position 3 over to position 4, then when one looks over at the sun will have been going from Sagittarius into Capricorn. So I'll write Capricorn over here. Capricorn. And that, as you might imagine, would be the winter solstice. So that is how this motion of the Earth around the sun accounts for the perceived motion of the sun through the signs of the zodiac over the course of the year. Notice, according to this Copernican worldview, the plane of the zodiac is the plane of the solar system, as we would now call it. The Earth is going around the sun in that plane so that the sun appears to move through the zodiac. Also, incidentally, this would be too complicated to draw on this diagram, but Mercury and Venus and Mars and Jupiter and Saturn are all also orbiting the sun in the same direction around the sun, but in orbits that are smaller than the Earth's orbit or larger than the Earth's orbit, in the case of Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn, but they're all almost exactly in the same plane as the Earth. So the plane of the zodiac in this perspective is then the plane of the entire solar system. And this circle right here that I've drawn at this funny angle, while in the old view that was the equator of the celestial sphere, it still is the equator of the celestial sphere, but now one can see also that's the equator of the Earth. And the reason it's tilted is because the axis of the Earth is tilted in such a way as to be pointing always in the same direction, that is up at Polaris, the North Star. And incidentally, and going back to the point that Copernicus had made back on page 166 about the third motion of the Earth, the way he was thinking about the motion of the Earth, in addition to its spinning around its own axis, that's the first motion, in addition to its motion around the sun, which I've drawn here, he says the third motion is a motion so as to keep the axis of the Earth always aimed at Polaris. So if you think of the Earth as riding on a celestial sphere around the sun, if it's sort of embedded in this, kind of like a pebble embedded in the treads of a tire as a tire goes around, if it was really stuck, then you would imagine that whatever tilt the axis has, it would retain that tilt. So for example, if over here it was tilted outward away from the sun, the top of it was away from the sun, as it's moving around from position 4 to position 1, well, what would happen is that tilt would continue to be in the outward direction. And then over here at position 2, it would still be in the outward direction. And at position 3, again, it would be in outward direction. That's what you'd imagine if the Earth was sort of embedded in the celestial sphere. So to keep it tipped at Polaris, there must be kind of a rotation of this axis counter to that so as to maintain it always aimed at Polaris. He sees this as a third motion of the Earth. I suppose from a modern perspective, where we don't see the Earth as being embedded in a celestial sphere, we would just see this as stationary. It's always pointing in the same direction. Okay, so that's a brief explanation of the Copernican worldview. This is a summary of what he's talking about in this chapter.